I think that the issue is, what do we do now, Sam? It's 7:30, and we've only talked about profiling. And
Well,
I
I,
think our positions are
oh,
clear. We're just rehashing old stuff.
no, they're actually not so clear. But let's move on to
Yeah.
immigration. We'll get into the weeds in a similar way. People really want us to talk about immigration. You've been very outspoken on what you call an open borders policy, and you have alleged, at least that's how it seemed to me, that anything less than an open borders policy is a kind of collective punishment or bigotry or just a shocking lack of compassion for people who are fleeing the war-torn areas of the world. So I just want you to just explain what your position is on immigration and the migrant crisis in Europe.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, yes, I promote open borders because I think that it is important for people who are fleeing. Let's say if you look at the top five refugee producing countries, if you look at any of them, Syria is the first one. You can see the reasons why people are fleeing. They're being barrel bombed by the Assad regime. They have ISIS on one hand. They're being bombed by Russian forces on the other. Is the reactionary groups fighting there as well. So it makes perfect sense. If any of us lived in those societies, we would most probably also want to flee. As if you look at what's happening in Syria, 470,000 people have been killed. That's 11.5% of the population's been injured or been killed. Life expectancy has been dropped to 55.4 years. 45% have moved. 4 million of them have fled the country. 6.3 million are internally displaced. So if you look at those huge numbers, I think, oh my goodness, what's the least we can do, to sort of help people who are fleeing those awful conditions. And I think none of us disagree with the fact that it is awful.
Hmm?
It would be to open borders. I think when borders are closed and people are languishing behind them in mountains, for example, in trying to get into Turkey behind barbed wire, it is uh, something that I think is horrendous. We should be opening our borders. I think there's a misunderstanding here, though, that people think that because I'm pro open borders, it means that it's a free for all. No, it means that people are processed legally as well, that they are interviewed, as is always the case. There is no distinction between the processing that takes place in America and that which takes place in Europe. It's the same. I've been involved in refugee resettlement work. For example, I worked in the Sudan for 2 years with the US Refugee Resettlement Office, resettling people into the United States. I've also dealt with the asylum procedures both in the US as well as here in Britain. The procedures are very similar. They're based on the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 67 Protocol. Many of them are processed by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees if it's in countries bordering usually the countries that they're fleeing from. And then there's asylum procedures within each country, like the US has its own procedures, each country has their own, but they're basically based on the UN Convention and Protocol pertaining to refugees. So open borders doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. Obviously,
Well,
asylum is not a right for those who are war criminals, those who have killed, those who have committed genocide. That is part of the refugee protocol as well. And therefore, if someone is guilty, if someone has committed a crime, they need to be prosecuted, they need to be jailed. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that people who are fleeing for their lives shouldn't have protection, shouldn't have some form of refuge. And I think that we have a responsibility to help people, who are in more difficult circumstances. Go ahead.
do you make a distinction between political refugees who are fleeing political persecution and violence and more ordinary economic migrants who are just simply looking for a better life in the West?
Well, the U.S. asylum procedures in Europe, the UNHCR's guidelines, it says that a refugee is someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution, not only because of political opinion, but because of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group as well. And therefore, there are many reasons why people flee. For example, membership in a social group includes possibly atheists. It includes women who have faced honor crimes or FGM and so on and so forth. So there are a myriad of reasons why people flee, not just political. I do think, though, that this attempt at criminalizing and making illegal people's flight, calling them bogus, talking about the distinction between economic and political refugees. I mean, look at the situation in Syria. Let's look at the situation in Syria. Does anyone really think that there is any part of that country where people are safe and having an...
I don't think that's the criticism you're getting. The criticism,
people...
Maryam, let me just get a few more facts on the table so you can react to them. I think the criticism you're getting is, one, the phrase open borders seems to signify that there is no vetting, first of all, and I think
Well, of course there's vetting. Of course there's vetting. I've worked in the refugee field for 15 years, and I've been involved in vetting. It's interesting that I think I'm the only one in many of these conversations that have been involved in vetting.
Okay, but there seems to be
open borders. Look, separate from that fact, look, it is about a basic human right. When I talk about the right for everyone to have an education, for an end to faith schools, for the right to food for everybody, irrespective of, where they live and how much money they have, these are huge maximalist, human demands that are oftentimes unattainable, impossible, possibly. They might even seem to be like dreams. But we need to always talk about the big ideas, the big dreams, in order to be able to have a little impact in people's lives. When I talk about open borders, it is about the fact that, look, there are people who are fleeing for their lives. They are fleeing for their lives. Men, women, children who have gone through the most atrocious things, and who are literally dying to reach safety. They are literally dying in our seas, in mountains, at borders. So I'm calling for compassion.
Yeah.
As someone who considers myself a human rights campaigner, I am saying that we should have compassion. We should open our borders. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't be processed. That doesn't mean that war criminals should be allowed in. Of course not.
Well, Maryam, I don't think there's anyone listening to this conversation who doesn't share your compassion for the people who are fleeing for their lives. I certainly share it.
So we're on the same page.
Okay, but there are other people we are talking about. There's the fact that in many cases, something like 80% of the people showing up, it's been reported, are men. And if it was purely humanitarian, you would expect equal numbers, men and women and children, or some semblance of equality there. And they're coming not from Syria, but from North Africa, or Eritrea or other countries, and they clearly fit the mold more of economic migrants. And I'm just asking you, do you want to differentiate there, or do you believe that the border should be open to all economic migrants as well?
Listen, I mean, look, let's be clear about the statistics. If you want real statistics and not what the far right says, you look at the statistics that the UN High Commissioner for Refugees issues. They are the ones that give statistics globally on the numbers of refugees, where they come from, who they are, and so on and so forth. And it's very clear that 50% of Syrian refugees are children. It's equally divided between women and men, 50-50. Of course, you have more, obviously, this includes all the statistics. Sorry, this is what I want to say, not just those entering Europe, but also those going to countries bordering Syria, for example. So, and I find this interesting. What is this hatred of young men?
I'm not expressing hatred. No, Maryam.
Sam, I'm not saying.
Please just answer. Your time is limited,
Sam,
and our patience is limited.
I'm not saying you're saying that, but there is this sort of thing like, oh, if you're a young man, you should go and fight, and you should go and die, and you don't have a right to, refuge or safety. And only women and children do. Why?
I would never say such a thing, nor think it.
Oh my goodness, Sam!
Okay.
I didn't say you said that. I'm saying that there is this sort of attitude where, oh well, there's so many young men. Well, why don't they just stay back and fight? I didn't say you said that, but this is
Okay.
some of the
But the
arguments you
only
hear.
reason why, just to make it clear,
And I
Maryam, I
say,
just have
well,
to
why
clarify
not?
this. Maryam, the only reason why I raise the disparity between men and women is that it is a very common practice for working age men seeking better lives abroad, not asylum, but for economic reasons, to go first and then bring their families after them. And that all I'm asking you, I'm not even disparaging that project at all. I'm just asking you if your conception of open borders differentiates between seeking asylum and seeking a better life economically.
Okay, so let me say this. I think that if UNHCR says that now there are equal numbers of women entering Europe as there are men, and I think part of the refugee flight is that oftentimes families will stay at refugee camps while men try to reach safety and to see if the route is safe enough for their families to join them. Other times, of course, entire families come. So again, there are reasons behind that. I think, again, also that Syria is not the only country where refugees are fleeing from. I think if someone from Iran flees because of the very nature of Sharia law, if you're gay, if you're a woman, if you're a dissenter, if you're a free thinker, that you wouldn't want to live there. Many people don't, that you would want to flee. I think it is impossible to distinguish between those who come for economic reasons and political reasons, because if you look at the numbers coming, they are coming from areas where there is either war or also theocracies and movements like Islamist movements, where there's a lot of restrictions on people's rights and lives, and therefore, this dream of, living somewhere safer, better, where you are freer, is a dream we all have. And I think, if anything, the migrant crisis and the flight of refugees shows is that despite what cultural relativists say, that actually people everywhere, want to live free. And in a sense, that's why they all want to come to Europe. Some people will say, well, why don't they just go to Saudi Arabia? Well, I sure as hell don't want to go to Saudi Arabia. And I think most people wouldn't want to go from Syria into Saudi Arabia. They prefer to come here. And there's obvious reasons for that,
Again, I'm not even clear what your view is here, so I just want to nail that down. So you don't want to distinguish between asylum seekers and people who are migrating for other reasons, economic or otherwise, because all of this is knit together and everyone is seeking a better life, and they have a right to seek a better life in a global world where we're all just human beings. I understand that, but are you saying that there is no limitation on the number of people that the Europe or America or the West in general should accept into its borders? We should vet people for war crimes, but otherwise everyone should be able to immigrate anywhere they want to.
Well, yeah, yes, Sam, I do think that. I mean, I also think faith schools should be banned. I also think that, we need secular societies everywhere. Not many governments don't necessarily agree with me. Many people don't necessarily agree with me, and that's fine. But these are the positions that I think are important to make. I think the fact of the matter is that, we live in a world now, it's a global world, and it's very, very small. And people move for a million different reasons. There are a lot of people moving out of Britain to Spain, to other countries, retiring there. In fact, until very recently, more people were leaving Britain than actually entering it. This is the reality. I find the fact that we never question the right of someone born and raised in Britain to move to Spain. That's their right. But we question why someone from Iran would want to come to Britain. And I think, the fact of the matter is, especially with the reality of the internet age and social media, the fact that now we are so close to each other, we feel the effects of Islamism here, as do young people in, Syria and Iran. They want to live a free life. And they have a right to. And I think whether they come for economic reasons, don't forget, and you know better than anyone, people living in the US know better than anyone, that immigration is good for the economy. People want to work, they want to contribute, and immigrants generally, if you look at statistics anywhere, they bring in more than they take. Of course, they also put pressure on schools, on libraries, on hospitals, and that's not because necessarily necessarily that we aren't able to cope with them, but it's because very often governments put profit before human need, and they're not willing to put money in schools and education. And we're seeing that ourselves. In Britain, every day our hospitals are closing, our libraries are closing. It's got nothing to do with migrants. That's just the way very often the system works. And so I think actually, in general, migrants are good for our societies, particularly if you look at a lot of European societies. It's an aging population. We need young people to pay for our pensions and for our retirement funds, and to fund our hospitals, to staff them, our schools, and so on and so forth.
Okay,
And so I think it's a very positive thing.
Well,
It's
I
a
would
very, very
agree with
positive.
you. I would
But
agree with
can I
you.
also just make one other comment too? Is that, for those of us who've worked in the refugee field, there are so many historical resonances with the attitude towards migrants historically. How Jews, for example, were perceived in the US, in Europe even, the sort of anti-Jewish refugee propaganda at the time, the fact that they were often accused of not being genuine, the fact that they were often said that, they can never integrate into our societies. That's those sort of arguments. If you've actually, when you work in the refugee field and you look at the history, you see that each wave of immigration or flight is met with the same sort of prejudices, the same sort of accusations, until a new set comes, and then it focuses on the new set of people, And I think even, for example, they'll say, oh, well, they don't speak English. Well, if you look at the immigration experience, you see that the first generations necessarily don't speak as well. The second generation, they act as a go-between between the first generation and society, and then you've got the third generation completely integrated. So I think we need to look at it in that way, but also to realize that we live in another world now. There is mass exoduses because of various reasons that, again, let's not forget, also some of our governments have a responsibility in creating. If you look at the situation in Syria, you've got, for example, the Iranian regime involved there. You've got the Russians involved there. The Turkish government is involved there. You've got the US government, the British government. They are involved in various ways. And therefore, there is also some level of accountability there too. Nonetheless, I'm looking at it just from a human perspective. For me, I think, if we can feed everyone, we should do it. If we protect people who need refuge, we should do it. Why not? What is wrong with demanding open borders? Why is it seen to be such a despicable demand?
No, it's
when
not.
It is such a fundamentally human demand. I'm
Maryam,
not saying you're saying that. I'm not saying you're saying that, but I have Pegida people, deputy leader of Pegida, saying that I am promoting a rape culture because I'm defending open borders.
Well, listen,
and this is their
Maryam,
propaganda, and so
okay, but there's propaganda on both sides. So at the beginning of this conversation,
thank you for always reminding us of that,
well,
Sam.
Again, this is the kind of thing I'm trying to rectify in talking with you, and I don't know it's going to be successful. But at the beginning of this conversation, you said something about any talk of defending one's culture and worried that your culture could be destroyed by immigration, mass immigration, open borders, which is in fact the worry of someone like Douglas Murray, that is tantamount to bigotry or energizes bigotry. And I think that is a needlessly polarizing and, in fact, inaccurate thing to say. And it's not that there aren't bigots who speak in those terms, but It seems to me to be totally reasonable to worry what would happen if you just opened the borders. And you have to be willing to talk about it, right? So let me just say a few things about my concerns, and you can react. And if you detect any bigotry here, please point it out. So I agree with you. We are trying to build a global civil society, and we have to get beyond nationalism. We certainly have to get beyond xenophobia, and we as a species are struggling to do that, right? And there are political aspects to this and economic aspects to this, and we have a lot to work out. But the reality of the situation is that merely opening the borders, right, given the ease of travel and given how terrible life is in various parts of the world, I would expect that if you just open the borders, if we put you in charge here and we just let everyone go wherever they wanted to go, societies would reach some kind of equilibrium with respect to all of the variables that determine the quality of life in that society, which is to say that people would only stop coming to Europe or America once there was no longer a good reason to come, right? I mean, once Europe, for instance, was no better a place to live than the Middle East or North Africa. That, I think, would be the practical consequence of a true open borders policy. And that is something that terrifies someone like Douglas Murray, and for understandable reasons. And when you look at the specifics, and again, I'm not arguing that huge disparities in wealth and political freedom are a good thing, but to merely import vast multitudes of people who don't share the values of the West, right, and are not inclined to adopt those values. And I'm not talking about everyone, obviously. There are people who, as you say, are fleeing theocracy, who are closeted secularists or atheists or feminists, who are aspiring scientists, who are intellectuals, who are desperate to get to places like Oxford and Cambridge, right? I'm not talking about those people, and I think those are the most important people in the world to support, whether they're coming from Iran or Eritrea or anywhere else, or Syria, obviously. But Douglas's point that he made on my podcast, and is a point that I can't see how you can just disparage as synonymous with bigotry, is that we know that if we just open the borders and let millions upon millions of people come into Europe from countries like Syria and Iraq and Iran and Muslim majority countries, you will be importing vast numbers of people who don't share Western values. You'll be importing vast numbers of Islamists, first of all, and other conservative Muslims. And given the problems of assimilation thus far in Europe, it's hard to see how that simply makes Europe better and not a lot worse. And I'm now going to give you a chance to react to this, but I just want to finally make a point about your personal perspective as an ex-Muslim. I don't see how you can paint such a rosy picture of this, because you as an ex-Muslim have escaped theocracy. You are someone who has struggled to escape the social attitudes and even threats from Muslim men in these communities. And yet you seem to be saying that it's a sign of bigotry not to want to absorb an unlimited number of these people, even Muslim men and even Muslim men who could be guaranteed to harbor the very beliefs and attitudes that you have been trying to fight against and that you have personally escaped. That seems to be a bit of a paradox to me. Please react to that.
It's not at all a paradox. I mean, there's so much here. I really don't know where to start. But let me try to go point by point. I mean, I think for me, it's because I can see people. I don't see collectives. And I think that's where we disagree with Douglas Murray, with yourselves. I don't see a collective. So for me, I don't see, Muslim men or all these migrants bringing in some sort of culture that is inhuman and misogynist, because I don't see culture as being static. I don't see it as being homogeneous. I see, not everyone in a society, even if it is a Muslim majority country, have the same values, the same culture.
It's not everyone. It's just percentages. Exactly. It's just percentages we're talking about.
Whatever percentages, whatever you want to call it.
So Islamists. Let's talk about Islamists.
I don't have a rosy picture, because I judge people based on what they do as individuals. So for me, it doesn't frighten me that there are Muslim men coming in, because those Muslim men may also be great defenders of women's rights, and they're not, because for me, being Muslim does not automatically mean being Islamist, just like being a white male does not necessarily make someone automatically.
But I'm not saying it does, but there'll be a percentage of them. If I can just
finish, Sam, please, if I can just finish, because there's so much you said that I'd really like to answer. The thing is, I think with the sort of perspective that Douglas Murray promotes, which is the sort of, our culture, and they're going to bring their culture in, I don't subscribe to this whole clash of civilizations thesis. And I think, the reality of the matter is there is no us and them. There are, theocrats and misogynists British born and European born or American born, and there are atheists and secularists and free thinkers who are Iranian born or Syrian born. And, therefore, I don't subscribe to this view that if you have Muslims coming in, and I put Muslims in quotes because they are not necessarily Muslims, or they might be Muslim in name only. There are a million ways we can define people, and not just, and also the fact that values is not, not everybody has necessarily Sharia values or Islamist values. A lot of people in Iran, for example, defend so-called Western values, universal value, what I call universal values.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the movement in Iran, unveiling in Iran, to be unveiled because it's compulsory could end you up in prison for 2 months. But there is a huge movement of women taking off their veils, as a sign of protest to the compulsory veiling rules. You have women carrying the body of Farkhonde, who was killed when a mullah accused her of tearing the Quran. Even though it is against Islamic customs, her family agreed with them to carry the coffin. And when one of the mullahs in the area came to pay his respects after he had said that Farkhunda deserved to be killed, they circled her body and said that he is not allowed to come to her funeral. They kicked one of the most well-known mullahs out of her funeral. So there is no us and them. There are free thinkers and women's rights campaigners in the smallest villages of Iran and Afghanistan, and there are bigots and theocrats in the biggest cities of America and Britain. And my point is that when you say you're defending your culture against this alien, savage, barbarian culture, there is some bigotry there, because it fails to see the humanity of people. It places collective blame and equates them with the theocracies and the oppressive forces that they're fleeing.
But
and
Maryam,
I think it's important. Can I just finish? Sorry. There are many, many, many people who are languishing in prison, who are being arrested by morality police, who are facing threats and intimidation, not just great heroes like Raif Badawi or Avijit Roy, who was hacked to death in Bangladesh, just ordinary people pushing back their veil, challenging the morality police, questioning religion and dogma on Facebook. Ordinary people, ordinary people, many of them are part of those migrants. Many of them are considered the Muslim majority, and they're not. Or even if they are Muslim, they're not Islamists. And that's why I think, what I find ironic, let me tell you this. What I find ironic is that a lot of people will criticize identity politics, and they'll criticize multiculturalism and the fact that, things are divided into various cultures. But you find that the far right, and also people like Douglas Murray, who's not on the far right, in my opinion, use a sort of white identity politics, defending our Europe, our values, our culture against the other, the brown men, the savages, And I don't subscribe to that. You mentioned, for example, Mark Stein, or, before in your discussion with Douglas Murray, and this concept of demography as destiny, because you do mention something about what happens when there's so many Muslims in Europe or in America. And Kenan Malik has this brilliant criticism of Mark Stein, where he says, well, if demography is destiny, well, then everyone should become an Islamic theocracy like Iran, because in Iran, the demographics, the Muslim population has decreased since an Islamic regime was established. So it is sort of reducing things to, Muslims versus, Europeans, Enlightenment values. Kenan Malik says something else that's brilliant. He says, Enlightenment values is not stitched into the DNA of every single person who lives in Europe. And it's just the same as Sharia is not stitched into the DNA of every person who is coming from the Middle East or North Africa or South Asia. Mm-hmm. And for me, I think I gain strength and courage from the fact that, I see so many allies amongst Muslims. And that's why I don't feel that because I am an ex-Muslim, I should be afraid of Muslims. Many of them are my allies. They are my friends. They have stood with me, and they will stand with me. And and I think it is a mistake if we buy into clash of civilizations. We fail to see the many friends we have who are deemed other, and we think that people on the far right, because they look like us, are our friends, when actually they are very similar to the theocrats that many Muslims and ex-Muslims are fighting.
Okay, but yes, I do not doubt for a minute that there are millions and millions of people in Muslim-majority countries.
But it's okay to profile them, and it's okay for Douglas Murray to say our culture. Well,
Listen,
you have to choose a side,
and no,
Sam,
no,
they
but
are
Maryam,
not the same
Douglas
position.
doesn't even
Sorry.
doubt what I'm about to say. I know Douglas as an untiring champion of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. That's how we first met. It's in defending ex-Muslims that we first bonded, right? And I have no doubt that there are millions and millions of potential Maryam Namazies and Ayaan Hirsi Alis, or actual ones in hiding out of necessity in Muslim-majority countries. And I've said over and over again that these are the most important people to support. And
they're not in hiding, though, Sam.
Oh, they're not all in hiding.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not important.
If you read Karima Benoon's book on Your Fatwa Doesn't Apply Here,
yes,
she's interviewed more than 300.
They're taking some of them are taking huge risks. And there's no question. Yes, they're not all in hiding, right? Okay, but this Douglas's point stands here, and I've yet to hear you answer it. And it does come down.
No, I have answered it, Sam.
Please,
you just don't like my answer.
You haven't heard. I can assure you that when hundreds of thousands of people listen to this conversation, they will say that you have not yet answered it. Okay, so
that's fine.
If you want,
there are others who will listen to it.
If you want a chance to answer it, let me ask the question again.
Listen,
please.
Sam, I've just explained that I don't subscribe to the clash of civilizations.
I understand that.
That Douglas Murray does, and that you are defending.
Okay, I'm not. No,
it's as simple as that.
I'm asking you to answer this specific question.
Sam, I'm sorry. You cannot say that you support Douglas Murray's concern for our culture, white European culture.
It's not white European culture. It's value. It's the very values. It's the very values that you support of secularism and tolerance and democracy and human rights.
You cannot say that, and on the other hand, say that those who are coming from Muslim-majority countries, I should be afraid of them as an ex-Muslim. What I'm saying is these two are contradictory positions, which you are putting forward.
There is no contradiction here.
There is no contradiction in what I'm saying.
The contradiction is this, okay, or the question you have not answered is this. And it comes down to percentages. And you're saying that you see people as individuals is not an answer to this question. I see people as individuals too. I know that there are individuals on every point of the spectrum of belief and unbelief in the Muslim world. But here's the reality of the situation. If you bring in 1 million people into Germany from the Middle East, some percentage of them will be Islamists, some percentage will be conservative Muslims. Let's just talk about conservative Muslims who are not inclined to assimilate. Now, my question to you is, does it matter at all what percentage that is? Is there a difference between living in a society where 5% of the population is conservative Muslims and 50% or 75%? Is that a difference that someone like Douglas is justified in caring about?
Look, I mean, Sam, I don't think Douglas Murray is justified, and he thinks I am not justified. We're having a discussion about our opinions, right? The fact of the matter for me is that even if someone is a conservative Muslim, it does not make them a jihadi or an Islamist. You can have people who are anti-abortion, who don't go and bomb abortion clinics. You can have people who...
Please just change conservative Muslim to Islamist. Okay, just swap in that noun and tell me if
that's the
then I'm re-asking the question.
Those words.
There's a spectrum here. We're using this word slightly differently. I want to connect with your definitions. You are concerned about Islamists. It would seem to be rational for you to be concerned about what the percentage of Islamists actually is in any group of immigrants.
But
are you concerned about that?
No, the Islamists. They might be British born, they might be American born, they might be white, they might be brown, they might be black. My concern are Islamists. And I think that if you want to target Islamism, target Islamists, target the jihadis, target the Saudi regime, the Iranian regime. target those Islamic organizations that are normalizing and promoting Islamism. Don't target people
Okay.
just because of their belief. It's as simple as
Okay,
that.
but
So I think
Islamism is a set of beliefs, Maryam. And if you're in the process of vetting
it's
immigrants,
a political movement, yeah, because you can, this is the example I was giving. You can have a neighbor who is anti-gay and thinks that gay people are perversions. It's very different from being part of a movement that wants gay people dead. There's a difference.
well, it's a difference of degree, yes.
It's a very big difference because it's one of difference between action and belief.
Sure.
So it's the difference between inciting even hatred or hating someone, or actually inciting violence. These are very different things.
Still, it's a spectrum, and
It's
people
a
are.
spectrum, of course. It's
But
a
so
spectrum,
my
of
question to
course.
you is,
We
if you
should be
found that
concerned
someone was an
about-
Islamist in the process of vetting them as a migrant, would you want them in or out as an Islamist? They haven't hurt anybody. They're not a war criminal, but they're clearly an Islamist. What do you
Listen,
do at the border?
if you want to fight a political movement, you have to fight it politically. You cannot fight a political movement by banning it, by deporting people who subscribe to that movement. You have to challenge it. It's the same with the far right in, let's say, in America, the Tea Party, Trump. You can't stop him by silencing him. You can't stop him by deporting him to Britain or another country that likes him. You can't send him to ISIS and hope that they'll get along. You've got to challenge his ideas. You've got to fight him. When this argument is reduced to a question of migration status, one's citizenship status, what sort of papers one has, what sort of color one is, what sort of beliefs they have generally, just because they happen to unfortunately have been born in some, to Muslim parents, because that is the only reason why people are considered Muslim, is because they were born to Muslim parents, then you are not dealing with the real issue, which is Islamism, which is the far right. And it's not just the Islamist far right, it is the religious far right in general, which I think the EDL, Pegida, Tommy Robinson also belong to. So for me,
But again, they're not killing
challenging them all
homosexuals.
is an important challenge.
But if you want to keep the distinctions that you find so important in a Muslim context stable, you have to admit that the EDL, as far right as they are not killing homosexuals or committing honor violence against women, right? It's a huge difference.
Sam, that is a very, very low bar, and I'm sorry, my bar is a lot higher. There are Islamists who do not decapitate people.
That is the bar you use to
talk
distinguish
about-
conservative Muslims from
there
Islamists.
Are Islamists who are considered soft Islamists. They are considered moderates. I'm sorry, I don't need to line up the heads of decapitation heads to decide whether a movement is bad for humanity or it's good for it. For me, I think if the Pegida is only burning down a few asylum centers, well, they haven't decapitated anyone. Well, I'm sorry, burning down refugee shelters is not good for me either. I don't have such a low bar on far right. I don't decide one is better just because they haven't managed to decapitate anyone. Based on that logic, we should like the Iranian regime because they only hang their apostates. They don't decapitate.
It's the logic you just used, and it was good enough in the context of differentiating conservative Muslims from Islamists, from jihadists.
My problem is the far right, the religious far right. For me, Islamism and, you've got Breivik, for example, in Norway, who killed all those young people. I think if you've got the Hindu right in India. They're responsible for the massacre of Muslims in the Gujarat. You have the Buddhist right killing Muslims in Sri Lanka and Myanmar. These movements, yes, they're not as bad as the Islamists. I agree. They're not as bad because they don't have several states. They don't have 13 states that punishable apostates by death. They don't have Sharia law everywhere. But don't forget, many of our countries didn't have Sharia law 40 years ago either. This is a political movement first and foremost.
With open borders, you have no concern that you'll wind up with...
No, Sam, I don't. I don't have concern because I think, you know what? I see people coming in, people who need protection, people who need safety, women, men, children who are fleeing the most outrageous, violations of rights today, whether it's the Assad regime or the ISIS. We talk about ISIS being fascist day in and day out. We talk about how barbaric they are. They have issued fatwas against refugees, saying that refugees who leave the Islamic State are all kafirs. How dare they leave an Islamic State?
Again,
and on the other hand,
we're not just talking about those people.
Aren't they also ISIS? You can't have it both
Maryam,
ways.
again, and I realize now we're out of time and out of patience, but I just
know.
want to make it clear we're not just talking about those people. We're talking about truly open borders to.
Okay, let me say something, Sam. Let me just say this. I say treat people as individuals. If they've committed a crime, if they rape a woman in Cologne, prosecute them to the full extent. It doesn't matter if they are white, brown, yellow, green, if they are Muslim, Christian, atheist, prosecute them to the full extent of the law. If they are Islamists that want to impose Sharia law, if they want to blow up innocent people or even people who are not innocent, prosecute them to.
Great statement.
Do not target
just
Muslims
stay there.
or
Just stay there.
migrants.
Wait, Maryam. You can't prosecute people for Islamism. You just said this. You can't deport Donald Trump, right? You have to fight ideas with
them.
ideas.
I didn't say deport, prosecute. If they've committed a crime, prosecute them.
Okay, but you
If
can't
they
prosecute
haven't committed a crime,
Islamists.
challenge them.
What do you do at the border with an Islamist?
You challenge ideas. You challenge far-right
Should
movements.
Islamists be free to immigrate wherever they want to in Europe?
Look, the thing is that when you agree on fundamental human rights, rights are for people you hate, you despise. If you are against torture, you are against the torture of some lovely left-wing communist person like myself, and you are against the torture of some despicable Islamist jihadi in Guantanamo. If you agree that torture is wrong, in the same way, the right to asylum, if the person is conservative, if they are not secular, if they are anti-gays, if they are anti-women, the very fact that they need refugee and protection, they have certain
But we're not just
rights.
Talking about asylum. We're talking about migration. So
migration, whatever.
So Islamists,
Sam, I wouldn't worry. Trust me, the borders are so closed. There is such a fortress up there that for every one person that enters, there are hundreds of thousands who are not able to. I wouldn't be so concerned. What I would say is that for every person that comes in who is a jihadi, who should be prosecuted for crimes against humanity, there are hundreds of thousands of people who just want to live in a society where they can breathe. We agree that Islamism and theocracy is so vile. A little compassion for people fleeing it is the least that one can expect, especially of atheists who are so critical of religion all the time.
But Maryam, again, this leaves out the crucial truth, which is, again, you're castigating someone like Douglas for focusing on.
I have no problem with Douglas Murray. I am talking about his politics. I'm sure he's a lovely person. Every time I've met him, he's been nothing but charming. But my point is, I'm not talking about an individual. I'm talking about a certain type of politics that sees this as a clash of civilizations. I see so many allies amongst those who are trying to enter Europe, who are Muslims, who are migrants. And I know that many of them are fleeing because they want to breathe free. Many of them have taken risks. Many of them just want to live 21st century lives, which is impossible under an Islamic theocracy, under ISIS.
I feel nothing but solidarity with those people. I just have one final question for you. What percentage of the Muslim community do you think?
I don't know.
You don't know. But can you guess? I mean, we're talking about 5% or 95%?
Sam, I don't know. Look, the thing is, because, don't forget that if you look at pictures of Iran or Afghanistan 30 years ago, you wouldn't recognize it today. You know that.
Yes, I do know that.
Okay, so this is not because of people's culture. It's because Islamism has just come and bulldozed over those societies and imposed the niqab, imposed the veil, imposed Sharia law.
But you seem to have no concern of that happening in London.
No, I don't have concern. How many times am I supposed to tell you? I'm concerned about the Islamists. I'm not concerned about people. I'm not concerned about people. I'm concerned about the Islamists.
But you're not concerned about the Islamists in London.
I'm concerned about an Islamist in Iran, in the Saudi government, as well as on the streets of London. I'm concerned with it all. I see it as a global political movement that is killing and slaughtering people. And most of the people they're killing are people in the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia. They are slaughtering. In Iran, they have slaughtered an entire generation.
Yes,
There are
but
countless people buried in mass graves. I am concerned about this movement.
okay, but
But
we
what I'm
all are.
saying,
What's so
okay,
frustrating is that you're not acknowledging how open
no,
borders interacts unhelpfully with that concern.
because I don't equate people, Muslims, migrants with Islamists in the same way that every white male I see is not a neo-Nazi fascist to me. I'm like that. I make those distinctions between people, individuals, and political movements. And that is the fundamental basis of my politics. Human rights for everyone, including people I don't agree with, criticizing
I
and
agree with that
challenging
too.
with unequivocally far-right fascist movements, whether they are fascists that we like because they criticize Islam and Islamism, or fascists, and there are people, the regressive left, who like Islamists and will side with them. I'm against all fascists, all types of fascists. They don't necessarily have to have decapitated anyone for me not to like them and to oppose them. And for me, I defend people. You can be Muslim, atheist, brown, yellow, black. You have rights, whether I like your opinions or not. If you have committed a crime, if you have raped, if you are going to commit a terrorist atrocity,
And
if
how do
you're a
we know that?
jihadi, I oppose you. I oppose you, but you fight that movement politically because it's a political movement, not by scapegoating, not by profiling, not by basing collective blame on masses of people, many of them who are
But
resisting this movement
so you're
too.
saying you cannot fight it politically by maintaining your borders. That is an illegitimate tool to use in the political fight against the spread of Islamism.
Sam, look, the borders are defended.
Well, you don't think
Worry
they
so
should?
much.
You don't think they should be? That's what I'm trying to understand
Well,
in your
no,
position.
listen, that's not true. And I've explained that a million times. The fact that I say borders should be open doesn't mean that, tanks of jihadis can just roll in and you've got to stand there and twiddle your thumbs while they roll in.
No
Or
one's
for
talking about
people.
tanks. I'm just
Well,
saying.
well, I'm just giving an example. I'm saying open borders for people. That doesn't mean there's a vetting process. That doesn't mean
What do you do when you discover they're Islamists? I've asked
you
this question
prosecute
several
them.
different ways.
Prosecute
You
them.
can't
Prosecute them.
prosecute someone for their beliefs. You're the first to make that point. You
No,
can't prosecute an Islamist for Islamism.
no, you can prosecute an Islamist if they are imposing Sharia law, if
I'm
they
talking
are.
about someone who's immigrating or attempting to immigrate into Europe from one of these Muslim majority societies, and
You challenge them, you fight them politically. That's what I do all the
so
time.
so
I
you
am
bring them.
challenging
Okay,
Islamists
but
who are
again,
born in Britain,
this
but
is
also
all
who have come
this is a
abroad.
needlessly confusing point. But I still don't understand your position here, and I promise you this is the last question. But I've asked this several different ways. You must still bring them into Europe and then wait to prosecute them, right? Or
Listen,
find some basis
I
to
didn't
prosecute them.
Look, I didn't say bring them in. Look, this is the question. When people are against the coming in of migrants and refugees, they'll say that these are all bogus and they want genuine refugees. Well, the only way you can determine genuine refugees are a refugee is someone, by definition, legally, who has left their home country and who has come to either a bordering country or a country of third asylum to apply for refugee status. So they have already left their country. Therefore, there is no determination on whether they are genuine or bogus by the very fact that they have fled. Where that determination is made is once they have arrived, then there is asylum procedures, whether it's in the US or Britain, or there is refugee processing in a country like Turkey by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. So refugees flee, they come, they register, they are interviewed, they are vetted, they are processed. That has been the way it has worked for decades. That is how you determine who is a refugee and who isn't. When you advocate that people can't even enter into a border, your concern is really not bogus versus genuine refugees. You just don't want people to come. You have to let people enter a safe haven
but what do you
in order to then be.
What do you do once you vet them as Islamists?
Well, you vet them. In the US, for example, if you are known to have committed a war crime, if you have
No, they haven't
committed.
committed a war crime. They have a belief system that they articulate, which
Okay,
is
if they have a belief system that has not violated anyone's rights, that has not been involved with killing
no,
civilians
but
in
they want to
Syria.
live under Sharia law.
Okay, well, listen, lots of people believe in lots of ridiculous things, and they can be very reasonable to some. I think some atheists have very ridiculous assertions on certain things. A lot of people think I am completely ridiculous. That's part of the fact that we don't all think the same. It's very normal that we don't. I think we cannot determine who has rights based on whether we like them or whether we agree on them. People have rights even if we don't like them, even if we disagree with them, even if we find their views vehement. And that's the difference. If no crime has been committed, you're going to have, in the same way that in Britain, we have people who are conservative, who think that, who are Christian, who think that gay people are deviants, who are opposed to gay marriage, who are opposed to abortion and,
Yes,
women's right to choose.
yes.
I can't say that, you can't access healthcare because I don't like the fact that you're a Christian, fundamentalist. Because that's a right, the right to healthcare,
Okay.
the right to food, the right to education, the right to shelter, and the right to asylum. The fact that the right to asylum is not recognized as a basic human right by many people doesn't mean that it isn't one. And the fact that there are so many people who are demanding it, who need it,
Yes.
and it is a recognized right, actually, if you look at
Okay,
the
but
UN
again,
Convention.
now you're talking about the more narrow condition of asylum seekers as
It's
opposed
not
to
so narrow because it's political opinion, race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group. This is a very, very
yes.
broad category. And I would argue that anyone fleeing from a place like Iran, a place from Syria. If you look at, 91% of the refugees in the world are coming from the top 10 refugee producing countries. There are real reasons why they are fleeing.
No
You
doubt.
cannot, on the one hand, be an advocate against theocracy and Islamism and talk about how bad it all is. And then on the other hand, then say, the people who are fleeing it don't deserve to have a better
Okay.
life and
But
a different type of life
yes,
and protection
the
to each
problem
other.
is many of them are not, as we know, based on failures of assimilation thus far for
It
several
doesn't matter.
generations.
Look,
We know
okay,
they're
look,
not fleeing those
it's not
values.
true. It's not true. Muslims in this country were not even labeled Muslims several decades ago. They were called Asians. They were very much at the forefront of left-wing organizing around trade unions and anti-racist work. What happened in the past few decades as a result of multiculturalism, entire communities and societies have been marked with only one identity, and that is Muslim. And we've also seen the rise of the Islamist movement, which has helped in doing that because it feigns to represent all Muslims. And let's not forget that US foreign policy, for example, during the Cold War, it was part of US foreign policy to create a green belt and Islamic belt around the Soviet Union at the time, the Mujahideen, the Taliban. There is a history of supporting and arming the Islamists when they were not even mainstream. And now suddenly it's become our culture. They were not even part of our culture. They were in the periphery. If you look at the Iranian Revolution, it was a left-leaning revolution. The great powers, including the US, they met in Guadeloupe. It was called the Guadeloupe Conference. They decided that they prefer an Islamic state there because it fit the strategy during the Cold War. And now suddenly, 30 years on, it's become our culture. Wait for another 30 years and ISIS will be people's culture in Syria, because that's what happens when the oppressor writes history. They will determine what, people think and how people think, and the resistance will completely be ignored or annihilated. That is the reality of the histories of many of our countries. 30, 40 years ago, nobody wore a black chador in Iran. The burqa, it was no one had seen, these black sort of niqabs in many countries. In Mali, a lot of these dresses have now, this sort of niqab and burqa have overtaken the national dress. They say this is the Islamic custom, this is the local dress. It's not. It's taken over from people's local dresses, the shalwar kameez, the very colorful sort of boubous that women in Mali, for example, wear. It's completely annihilated appropriated that, taken that over. Give it 10, 20 years, suddenly it's become our culture. Douglas Murray is concerned about, us coming and overtaking, European culture, whereas in fact, what that sort of perspective fails to see is that this is a political movement. It has bulldozed over our societies. The reason we're fleeing is because we have no options to flee, that there is very little choice involved, and that not necessarily people fleeing are people who agree with the oppressors there. And also, if you look at what I think is a tsunami of atheism in the Middle East and North Africa, it is a backlash. There is a huge backlash against the Islamists, whether it's the unveiling movement in Iran, whether it is the young people in, for example, Morocco and Tunisia defying fasting rules and going and having a picnic during Ramadan when they can be prosecuted, and they are beaten by the police and jailed for doing so. There is a huge backlash as well.
Mm-hmm.
And many of those people are part of that backlash too. And that's why I say target the political movement, target the Christian right, the Islamic right, the Buddhist right, the Hindu right. Don't target Hindus, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists.
Okay, well, I will have to let that stand. I'm not sure we understand one another any better, but I thank you for attempting it, and I hope to meet you under more relaxed circumstances at some other point, Maryam.
I'm really grateful that we had this conversation. I feel very relaxed, actually, Sam. I think it's an important discussion to have. I think we it's the reality is that even very reasonable people will disagree. I think this is a saying someone brilliant has said. I don't know who it is, but that it is often possible for reasonable people to disagree with each other.
That is true. I was afraid at the beginning of this conversation, and I remain worried that you think we disagree far more than we do, and that there's just a fair amount of confusion still in the air. But I will let our listeners sort it out.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the listeners for trudging along.
Yeah. Finally, where can people find out more about you online? Give us your Twitter handle and all the rest.
So if they go on to www.maryamnamazie.com. That's my website, and also Twitter is @MaryamNamazie. And of course, there's so many campaigns I work on, like the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain, which is founded to break the taboo that comes with leaving Islam, or the One Law for All campaign against Sharia law in Britain. I, for example, have started a campaign called Fitna because the Islamists think women are the source of fitna and chaos in society. We're calling ourselves that. And we say basically that we are Islamism's worst nightmare. I've also done things like nude protest, because the Islamists hate us so much. They want us covered and, disappeared basically from the public space. Nude protest can be seen as a form of challenge to this sort of, very misogynist view of women. So there's lots of different things that maybe if we weren't stuck on this profiling and immigration issue, we could have talked about. But I do think profiling and immigration are hugely important, particularly amongst atheists. This conversation we need to have a lot of. So thank you for giving me that opportunity to do that.
Thanks for coming on, and my best to your friend Dia, who I believe is filming you during this conversation. Until next time, Maryam, thanks for your time. Okay, I will let you all do a post-mortem on that. I could not shake the fact that there was an impressive talking past one another there that I could never quite seem to correct for. No doubt some of the fault is mine. You should all know that some of the fault is also Skype. There's a delay in Skype, and when you try to interrupt somebody, the delay makes those attempted intrusions seem far more hostile or urgent. This is an imperfect technology. But all I can say is I tried. Now I'm going to go do something else. Perhaps a nude protest. If you enjoyed this podcast, there are several ways you can support it. You can leave reviews on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to listen to it. You can share it on social media with your friends. You can discuss it on your own blog or podcast. Or you can support it directly And there are two ways you can do this. You can leave a donation through my website at samharris.org/donate, or you can try a membership at Audible.